Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be taking a look at ways you can use scripting to create dynamic masks in vMix. So, this is sort of an interesting extension to some of the things we did with masking in a show earlier this season. So, before we get to that, I want to invite everybody, if you have any questions, any comments, any feedback, please just put them in the comments below. And if you'd like to join us here on air to talk through a question or discuss some point that we're going through, please, we have a link in the show notes and posted here down below. So we'd love to have you come and join us on the show. So this was when we decided to do this, we actually were going to take a different approach to the way we're doing today's show. And I'll get to that in our post show. But what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking and creating a configurable interface callout, basically a way to highlight elements on a screen through different zones. So let me show you more specifically what I'm talking about. So if I were doing a demo here and I wanted to highlight different segments of the screen, I would have the ability to go and call out these different segments and just have a little traveling mask that could go over any of these and let me show off different aspects of my interface. So this is what we've set up here. And unlike your traditional masking, specifically the masking we did in our last show, we are not using sort of photoshopped masks. Now we're creating these masks dynamically using a technique in scripting. And so we'll dive into that. The way we're defining these masks is we're using XML and we're creating basically zones that we're going to break out in the screen for display. So if you look here, the XML file is actually pretty simple. We have, we call everything the breakout of the screen, and then we have different areas that we would call zones. And each zone has a label that's associated with it, what that zone is actually about. And it also has the different coordinates of the edges inside that zone. So we have the top edge, the bottom edge, the left edge, and the right edge, all defined here. So left, right, top, bottom here. We had another field for assets that we were going to use for something else, but we didn't put that in. But all we have now is repeated zones inside the larger breakout XML file. And we're going to use these coordinates to create all of those different segments inside of our screen display for the different masking we're doing. So before we get to the next thing and look at the vMix, let me just check on the comment section here. And so we have James. James, thank you very much for joining us here. We also have John Simon. He said, made it for the show start for a change. John, great to have you here whenever you can get in. We have Samuel from Norway. Samuel, thank you for joining us. We have Studio Row, studio from Sligo, Ireland. I actually have a grandparent from Sligo, so welcome aboard. This is great. We have Sase. Happy Friday, Sase. Great to have you here. We have Aldoya from Bahrain. So Aldoya, thank you very much. And we have Otis giving us a howdy from Texas. Hi there. Thank you for joining us, Otis. All right, so let's actually take a look at what we're doing in vMix before we get over to the scripting. So the way we're handling the masking inside of vMix is actually we're splitting this up into 4 inputs. And in the base input, we just have a white background. So it's essentially an input that we assign a color to, and that color is white. We then have 4 other inputs that we have along here that are basically a color insert that is all black. And what we are doing is we are combining these as layers to create what would essentially be like flags and lighting, where you could set up a square, they call them flags, that would block out light from hitting certain parts of a set or talent. So we're basically building these 4 flags that we will use to carve out the white spot that we want to show through, which will be the visible part of our mask. So the way we do that, let me actually go and let's start with showing you what a mask would look like. So if I wanted to go and handle this part of the screen over here, where I wanted to highlight the master control section of the product, we have a mask over here. This is the mask that we're using to do that. The way we're creating that mask is we have left, right, top, and bottom panels. And we are just positioning those panels. So if I were to turn off the left panel, so that would be the panel that's covering up everything for this side. So if I turn off that left panel, you'll now see that this whole section becomes white. And you can see that's reflected over here in the image that we're seeing of the screen. Now, if I turned off the right, there's a little bit of dark on the right-hand side, and you can see we got rid of that. And I can do the same by turning off the bottom, which will get rid of that little bit of transparency we had at the bottom, and then just turning off the top here. And now I've disabled the whole mask, but all that we're doing is we're using those coordinates that we had in the XML file for the zone that we selected to turn on the mask a piece at a time. And so that is exactly how we're doing masking. So we can, using those coordinates, create any size rectangular mask anywhere on the screen. And we do that by positioning each of these panels. Now, one of the things in vMix which you might not be aware of is that even though you can use shortcuts and scripting to position an input, there is no way to use shortcuts or scripting to position layers in an input. So the only way we can do this is by having these as separate layers and positioning those layers directly, and that positioning then gets reflected when we have them stacked up inside of the single input with all the layers. So for that, as you can see, we just have left, right, top, and bottom sitting here as layers. And each of those, in this case, will have position information. So if you, oh, no, I don't have it inside. This is, I'm making my own mistake here. So if I go in here, you'll see that inside each one of these panels, let me go to the main panel here, you'll see that I have positioning information for the X and the Y, for the left and the right, and it'll be the X for the left and right and the Y for the top and the bottom. And so we're just pulling in that positioning information to a script. Now, the other piece that you should be aware of is that inside of vMix, you cannot use layers as part of your mask. So if I specify an input as a mask inside of vMix, the layers will not be included. So we needed to do a workaround for that. And the workaround that we're working with is we're using a mix input. So if you look at vMix here, there is down at the bottom this input here called mix. And this is only available here. You can't even get it. If I said add an input, you wouldn't even see it there. This is the only place you can get it. And there are 4 mix inputs that vMix provides. One is for the main mix, so it's already being used. So there are only 3 additional mixes, 2, 3, and 4. So we're using mix 2 here, and we are assigning it the output from this adjustable mat, which is the input with all the different layers creating this mask. So what this will do is it will flatten all those layers and create a new flat input that we can then use inside our masking. So that is the first part of what we're doing in vMix to create the mask and to have it in a format that can be used by other inputs to do the masking. So the next piece, though, is how we composite the elements. So we have a few things that we did here to do the compositing. So what I wanted when we set this up was to be able to sort of, I wouldn't say blur out, but to dull out the rest of the image, save for the piece that we wanted people to focus on, the zone that we have of interest that we're highlighting at a given point in time. So the first thing we had to do was create a couple of layers that would have a way to sort of do that dulling. So what we're doing is we have a background layer that we have created here, which is again just colored white. We just do the input, assign a color to that input, and choose white. We then have a feed that's coming. So this is coming from a system we have somewhere else here in the studio. That is actually, so if I put this here, you can see that this is just the UI, but it looks really dull. And let me open this up to show you why. So what we've done here is we've actually just set an alpha channel on this. And so that's why you have that sort of softened, sort of see-through image here. So by doing that, what we're doing is we have a white background and then the see-through image of the screen that we're using that creates that sort of blanched, washed out look on the rest of the background. And then on top of that, we are actually taking and putting the mask feed. So this is the feed with that same input. So it is, the identical input that we have, but in this case, we are applying the mask to it. So if I go over here to color key, you can see this is where I specified the mask that I'm using, which is that composite mask, the mix input number 2. And that's what we have here. And this now gives me that sort of call out, but the rest of it, as you can see from the masking, is fully transparent. So that gives me 3 layers. The white layer on the bottom, the semi-transparent layer, which is the full UI, and then the masked layer, which is just the cutout piece, the zone that we're showing on the UI. And we have that over here in the composite screen. So if you look at the layers here, this is our white background, the background feed, the image of the screen, and the mask feed that we have coming in. And so that is how we create this image that you see here on the screen. But how we manipulate the masks that we use, that's something that we use scripting for. So before we get to the script, which we'll dive into next, let me just check the comment section here. And we have Gilberto. Hello, Gilberto from Brazil. Great to have you here. Thank you. We have Jerry. Jerry, hi back. Thank you for joining us. And we have Justin. Hi again from Las Vegas. Justin, great to have you join us again. So sorry, we would have been out at NAB this year, but unfortunately that was canceled. So hopefully at the April event, we may get a chance to meet. That would be great. All right, so let's jump back and take a look at the script over here. So let me switch over to the actual script we have. So I'm going to try to go through this in a logical way and describe everything. I always appreciate feedback if we do the scripting pieces too quickly or too slowly. So let's please feel free to let me know. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to just post them in the comments and we'll get to them and go through it, because I want to make sure that what we cover makes sense to everybody watching. So for this script, what we do, and this is something that we do almost all the time, is we will load the vMix XML model. So that is the descriptor that vMix has of the state of every input. And it gives us the ability to go and access elements inside of vMix itself. And that comes in as XML. So we just declare vMix XML as a document, and then we use that here for everything we need to do. So we're pulling this in as the XML. And then the first thing we're doing is we're taking a look to say, what zone do we want to highlight inside our interface? And the place that we're doing this sort of zone variable is the dynamic value 1. And so vMix has 4 dynamic values that you can set, and when you move between scripts or any other things that you want to do, you can read those dynamic values inside of scripting, other shortcuts, and use those. So it lets you set something and then use that set value in another function. So in here, we are using vMix dynamic value 1. And you can see this is just the XML inside of vMix. So we're pulling that out using select single node, taking the text value and storing that in active node value. So this is telling us which node inside our XML we want to be working with. And then because we need this to be actually an integer, because we're using that as an index for walking through our XML, we do a convert to int32, which is taking that text and converting it into an integer. And we store that in active zone index. So in active zone index, this is the zone that we want to display on the screen. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to read a file which has all of these zone breakups inside of it. So this file is going to give us basically all the coordinates. And so we read this file, and it's just a file written right on our disk, but it could be on any other file accessible or URL accessible file that we could put there. So we take that and we save that as breakout.xml. It's an XML document using all that XML that we showed when we first started. And we use the load method to load that into the breakout XML document here. And so now in breakout XML, we have all of those XML zones described sitting there. So the next thing we do is we're going to go and find all of the ones that are defined as zones. So basically breakout was the sort of the root, and then we have zone, which is defining each of them. So we're going to load in all the zones that we have available, and we just do that here by doing a select nodes. And so what we're using, though, is what's called a node list. We've talked about this before. So an XML node list basically is a list of XML nodes. So it's almost like an array of XML blocks that we want to use. And so the zone list now has a list of all the zones that we can then index. And the zone count, there's a method inside for XML node lists that are count. How many nodes did we actually have in this list? So now that tells us, in this case, there'll be 10 nodes. So we know we have from node 0 to node 9 will all have valid XML in them. So we know that. So this is basically setting everything up. So now we have everything loaded. We have an array of all the XML, and we know how many are in that array. And we know which one of those we want to be working with. So the first thing we're doing is we're going to see if what we have stored in our dynamic value 1 is within the number of zones we have. So in case something changed, somebody edited the file, whatever, we don't want to get in trouble. So we're going to say if it's less than 0, or if it's greater than the zone count, then we know that we have an invalid zone index. And so we're just going to go over here and say, if so, just set it to 0. So we'll start with the root zone. And remember, we talked about this in our last show. There are different types. There's 0 indexed and 1 indexed. In a lot of arrays, they are what's called 0 indexed, which means 0 is the first element. So it's not a pointer to an element. It's an offset from that first element. So 0 is the offset in an array. Then 1 gives you the second element because you're 1 away from the first one. So that's basically what 0 index means versus 1 index. So we set that up if there isn't anything that's valid there. Otherwise, we'll just take whatever that active zone is, and we'll subtract 1 to get back to that 0 indexed value. And now we have our zone set. So we know which zone we want to pull. So let's actually dive in and do the pull of the information. So what we do first is we are going to grab the zone label. If you remember when we set this up, let me actually switch back to the output here. If I were to go and I'll switch over to something here. If I set this up, you see there's a little text that pops across the top that slides in and out. That's the label that we have that's associated with the zone. So we read that out of the XML files, a thing called label inside. So if we switch back to the code over here, you have the zone label as string. And so we're basically going in saying for the active zone, because it's an index, it's an array now. So we're going in that zone list, take whatever the active zone is and pull out the label, the text, and get the text for it. So that's the label that we're setting up. And we just use that in a GT title. So nothing special there. And now we're doing the exact same thing with the edge left, edge right, edge top, and edge bottom. We're just going in there, taking and pulling them out as text, but then converting them. And that's that convert to int32 in the front. We're converting them into integer values. And this is going to be a pixel value. So starting sort of from pixel 1 in the upper left-hand corner, and down to 1080, 190, or 1920 by 1080 as the pixel in the lower right-hand corner. So that's sort of the index that we're using for describing the zones. And we're pulling all of those out, and we have those 4 values. Now, if unfortunately with vMix, it does not use anything with pixels. vMix uses, and I'm not sure of the specific reason behind this, but vMix uses -2 to 2 as the positioning information on screen. So every pixel that you specify through a numerical index has to be converted into something in this -2 to +2 range that vMix has. So for vMix, it is for X and Y, it's -2 is the left-hand side and 2 is the right-hand side. But for top and bottom, top is 2 and the bottom is -2. So it's sort of that inverted mechanism for doing this. So that is something to keep in mind for everything we do going forward here. So what we have to do now is convert these pixels into this sort of decimal value that is a relative position in the number -2 to 2. So you're essentially dividing up 1920 by 4 and saying, okay, if it's totally off the screen, it's -2, which means that's 0. If it's in the middle of the screen, like 960, that is going to be 0. And then if it's covering the other edge of the screen, off the other edge of the screen, then it's 2. So not very clear, why. I mean, to me, they could have gone 0 to 1 or even -1 to +1. I'm not sure what the 2 gives you. The joke would be sort of like Spinal Tap. The amp goes up to 11, so it's louder than an amp that goes up to 10. It could be the same sort of thing here, where it just gives you more control, but it's a decimal space, so it doesn't really give you much more flexibility there. But what we've done is we've set these up. We'll post all of this, and you can set this up, but the logic will work through. This is how you do the conversions for each one of the coordinates that we need as a reference for doing the positioning. So we pull all of these out, we do these conversions. Now, since we've converted them, we're going to have to use these values now inside of shortcuts, inside of functions in the script. And functions use strings. So now we have to go and take these decimal values and convert them back into strings. So we have these variables that are strings that are edge left, vMX. So this is for vMix, edge left, and we just do a conversion of that decimal value to string. And there's a method to do this. You can just append the string with the decimal with a .toString method, and that will do the conversion for you. So it's very straightforward to do, just another step to be aware of. And now what we do is we call the functions to set each one of uh, the masks that we're using, what I call the flags, to set them up in the correct position. And so we have those in inputs 2 through 5. And so we set the pan X of input 2, which just slides that left-hand side. And then we have the pan X of input 3, which slides the right-hand side. And then for the top and the bottom, we do set pan Y, and that's top and bottom. And again, we're doing this to the root input, because you can't do these types of positioning controls inside of layers, which would be ideal if we could. So that's how we've done that. And then we are good. Now the last thing we have to do, because that actually created the mask. So the last thing we have to do is assign the label, the label of the zone that we have, to the GT title design. And this we did in the last few shows. So we're just using an API function set text. We have the input zone label, which is the GT title design, the input of the GT title design. This is the text inside GT title design that we're going to change. So it's just a little text label at the top. And the value we're setting is the actual text value of the zone label. So again, a very simple way to do it. And then we just throw that overlay on screen. And for purposes here, we just sleep for a second and a half and then pull it off screen. So that gives us a very easy way to label things that we want. So when we go to a zone. So let me just go back here and I'll sort of unmask this. So if we look at what we just went through, all of the positioning that we did was all around, let's go over here, was all around these mask elements. And that was, we then have those stacked on here, composite them, and we push that out into the mask for these composited elements. And over here, which I did mention, we have the zone title, which you can see this comes on and off, so that's just an overlay we have. And we do that in the scripting to pop that on and off. So this hopefully gives you some ideas for different things that you can do to create masks dynamically and to use them for these types of masking, highlighting. You know, there are lots of different ways to do this. And you could actually, instead of just using black to do squares, you could actually do things where you could position a circle around on screen that would highlight different things if you wanted to do that. But having that contrasting background adds a lot of punch to it, because now you take something which would otherwise just sort of be an outline and you make it stand out from the background, but without doing something like bevels or other things like that. So it keeps it visually clean, but still very prominent. So before we jump to the after show, let me just check to see if we have anything else here. Okay, so we have Karsten. Karsten, thank you. We definitely appreciate you spending time with us to watch these shows. So it's great having you as part of the community here. So we have Justin. Justin said he will be there when we get NAB back. So yep, it is one of our favorite events as well. We always look forward to it as it comes in the year. So it's been tough not seeing everybody and getting to mix with all the people in this industry. And it's 2 years now that we've missed it. So we're definitely looking forward to April. So we have American Newscape. Thank you. We appreciate that. And hopefully these are things that you'll be able to apply to the productions that you're putting together as well. So we will jump to the after show, and I'll go answer any other questions anybody has about any of the things we did here, or other questions about live streaming, video production in general, if I can. Happy to do that. But I'll start it by going into what we were originally trying to do for this show, but ran into a very strange problem that may impact other things that you will want to do So we'll share that in the after show. But if you can't hang around, definitely appreciate you making time for this show. And we'll see you next Friday. If not, we'll see you in a few seconds. Thanks, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So let me talk a little bit about something that we wanted to do. Uh, our original thought for this show was that we would let you take, and if you saw when I put together the, let me see if I can switch over to the mix here. When we had this and we had these set up, where I had these little call outs, what we wanted to do was to have this entire screen sort of be like a little shrunken down index in the corner of our display where you highlighted what part of the screen you were looking at. And then we were going to take this masked piece here and we were going to position it in the middle of the rest of the screen and zoom into it. So we basically take this and position it so you could get a zoomed in view of whatever it was we were talking about and still have the sort of the context of where on the screen is this taking place. And we did all the math first, so like how do you calculate where this would be? And things weren't working and we couldn't figure it out. But what we found out, so let me see if I can switch over here and just show you this here. Let's see. So if I call this up and I go in here and start to manipulate it, if I can position this, so you'll see I can slide this on and off the screen. So that's fine. Position it X, position it Y. And I can get it fully off the screen or either direction. But let me take and zoom this in. So say what I wanted to show you was something really zoomed in over here. You'll now see when I move that I can't get to the edges of the screen. So the pan is using so that indexing system inside of vMix is using the original 1920 pixels. And it's basically letting me pan within 1920 pixels in the zoom area. So it basically takes the 1920 pixels in the center. So if I'm zoomed 5 times, that means I'm basically missing, 4/5 of the image. I can no longer do anything with. So we couldn't do what we wanted to do. I thought that would actually be a very, very useful thing, especially like if you're giving presentations in classrooms or other stuff where having that big display of a small item on screen could be really useful. But I couldn't find an easy way to do it. And yeah, so yes, the control shift plus the click to move will let you go, but we could not find any way to do that with scripting or shortcuts. So this is actually, I think this is sort of a limitation right now. I'd love to see it. If I'm wrong, please, if there is a way to do that with a shortcut or script, love to do that. But this really stumped us because we thought logically, if that's your index space and it's relative because it's not pixel based, it would just say whatever I'm zoomed in, I'm doing that same type of movement and just using the zoom as sort of to increase the size of the field that I'm looking at. But I would thought that sort of -2 would get us back to 0 and +2 would get us to the other end. But it didn't work that way. So everything that we did in this, Studio Row said, did you try changing the values rather than using the slider? We actually didn't, and that would be something, that would be another thing we'd need to calculate, but that's a good point. So we'll actually, let me see if we can. So yeah, I know you can't change the values in here. So I believe when we did this, it just won't let you do it there. So if we, did the control shift on the slides here. So yeah, so in this, it might not actually work for pans the way we had thought. So uh, it may be something that is possible, but we haven't found a way. But this is more just a heads up that if you are using the zooms, uh, that you need to be aware of sort of the limitations that you may have with positioning. So would love any feedback on this if there is a way to do it. But we ran into this, and if we can get this, we'll definitely follow this up with something which does what our original plan was, because I think that would be a cool way to uh, do a presentation and sort of highlight areas as well. So definitely something we'd be interested uh, inside of scripting to be able to do. But so uh, so Miguel, what should I start? What should I say to start programming? So actually, I'll give you an opinion. The best way to start programming, and I mean this in all earnestness, is to start programming. Assign yourself a task. Find a piece of code that looks like it does something similar to what you want, and begin working with it. As my son is a programmer, and he says, Google is every programmer's friend. People in programming are always looking up references, whether it's Stack Overflow or other sites for how do you do certain things, how do certain functions work. So it's not something where everybody that's in programming just has this vast, I know everything and I can just do it. People look up stuff all the time. It's the thing about programming is much more about the engineering side of it. How do I take something that I want to do and break it down into a series of steps? And so if I were thinking about how do you really want to program, that is the key. Take, before you even look at code, and think through what are the steps I would need to do in order to accomplish what I want. And if you can outline all of those, that would be a great way to get your head into the programming space. But everything, from programming is an engineering discipline. It's taking complex problems, breaking them down into simpler problems, and then defining the steps you need to solve those simpler problems and combining it all back together. And you end up solving a complex problem. So that's really the start. But there's lots of good resources online. This is Visual Basic for vMix scripting. We've also done stuff with Google scripting, which is more like JavaScript. So there are different ways to jump in. But I think Vita Day Broadcast has a great point. It's understanding the flow of information and what you need to do to manipulate it, and then the rest is just the grammar. So sort of like writing a novel. Get a great story idea, flesh out the story, and then add the words to it. It's the same sort of thing with programming. So that's a very good point. And I appreciate that as a question, because I think it really is an important thing to keep in mind. Just think through the logic of how you want to solve a problem, and then look up, use Google, use other references to figure out what code you need to put together to do that. And there'll be lots of little things. So clearly, you can shoot us, if you have specific questions, but if there are other people around you that do programming, don't hesitate to ask. I think programmers by and large are a very generous group. The same as I found with people in the video and streaming profession. They'll share what they know. They'll guide you. But, the thing is, I think it's important, and this is for all of us, to put the initial effort in to try to solve it, try to look up, because people are much more willing to help to say, if you say, I went to here, I tried this, I looked this up, this didn't seem to do it, could you point me in the right direction, as opposed to, how do I do this? So I think how you approach this when you work with other people could also be important in getting people to work with you as you improve your programming skills. But it's definitely something that I think in the video production space, as it becomes all bits, it's going to be something all of us are going to have to get involved with at some level. And it lets you do a lot more stuff. It basically opens up a whole world of new production opportunities once you understand how to do even some basic stuff inside of scripting and programming. So let's see. Any thoughts on dynamic colors gradients in GT Title Designer, specifically for shapes? So in terms of setting up dynamic gradients, I'm trying to think of what I can do. I'd have to go back and, again, this is, as I mentioned, it's the Google being your friend. I will do this right here. So I'll go into my vMix shortcuts. And so go here, find the one for vMix 24 if it's here. They're all pretty close. So here we go. All right. So let me zoom this up. So if we were going in here, I would go to title, and that's where I'd start. Click search, and then go to the shortcut reference, and it will come down here. And as you go through, these are all the different things that you can do with titles. So I'm just looking to see what they would have here. So I'm not seeing something directly available here, but this is basically the approach. Like, so when we want to solve something, this is exactly where we start. So some of these things we know already, but so we'd look here, and these are the ones that are all under things we could do for titles. So I do not see anything here for setting box colors and box gradients. So, those are all inside of GT Title Designer, but I don't see something here right now. I mean, I could look a little deeper, see if they have it buried in some other place. But this would basically be one of the ways that we go in to solve a problem is really in the shortcuts guide. So let me. So Studio Rove has a question. I'll get to that in a minute, but let me talk just a little bit more here about when you're working with the titles, because this is one of the things that when we were thinking of mass, one of our thoughts was, gee, if we could control the cubes, basically the shapes that we put inside of GT Title Designer. So if I could describe, size, and position a shape, I could do the mass in GT Title Designer and then use that either directly or through a mix to feed the mask into the output that we wanted. But there was no way to do that here. So this was just as a point. This is something else that we had looked at before we went with sort of doing the flags to get that. But so that's something else. All these things, just think of how you could use everything that you have available to you, because some of these functions, they're not there. So how can you do it in another way? So I think that's the other piece. But certainly, things that could be interesting if you're trying to apply different techniques to different inputs, and the shortcut isn't there. So let me. So yeah. So Justin said he only found the thing for changing text code, and we agree. That's all I saw right there. But unfortunately, there are a lot of limitations. I'm sure, I would never second guess one product company for why they don't have certain capabilities, because there are probably lots of very good reasons if you understood the tech and the way they've structured code and set things up. But there are things that you would think would be there that aren't. And so, that's just, sometimes it's just a workaround. So let me get back to Studio Rove, because it's an interesting question to do the merge between the different masks. And that would look really great, because you could do that sort of nice, smooth shift over from one section to another as you move between zones. The challenge here is that merge really only works with layers that are in common between two different inputs. So there's no way, because we have to change the positions inside of the root element. So the left flag is a position flag. It's sort of, this is where that is. Because I'm doing that, there's no way for it to see itself in sort of a different position because I'm moving that. So if I copy it and move it to another place, it doesn't do a merge between those. So you don't get that value. It sees them as two different inputs and won't do a merge. So really, really wanted to do that and thought about different possible ways, but we just couldn't see anything because the things we're manipulating are the base inputs and not layers. Now, if this were something we could do with layers, and I could take and change the layer positioning and on a second input, merge between those inputs, that would work perfectly. You get exactly what you were looking for. That sort of smooth gradient moves. Unfortunately, that's not the case here. So I wish it were. But that said, you could do that sort of thing with fixed elements. So if I took and put those layers in one position and use them as layers and set the layer positioning, and then set another input and did those layers in different positions, you would get what you're looking for. So at the end, possibly I could try to do something here and just post it. But I believe that would get you there. But doing it dynamically, I don't think there's a way to do that. So let's see. So we have David. David, thank you for joining us from Costa Rica. Great to have you here. So let me see. So Vita de Broadcast said, on the vMix side, I believe that the biggest thing is that this is a piece of really cheap software that already does a lot. At some point, you need to break out from vMix and go to other solutions. Yes. So I mean, I think vMix vMix is sort of really well priced. I think this is interesting because we use TriCaster for switching out shows, and that's a production choice we made. My feeling about vMix is that it is an incredibly powerful piece of software, but it isn't always the friendliest piece of software to use. So it is pretty much like, almost like picking up somebody else's smartphone. You can't really easily find everything because everybody has their own way of sort of organizing the way they think and pull things together. But yeah, I understand. Vita is saying that he means cheap in a good way, and I'm meaning it in a good way as well. It really is an incredible amount of capability for a, relatively speaking, a very low price. But if I need to do something like what we did here, that's not something that I would begin doing in TriCaster easily. It's a lot of these things where we did, the integration with the weather maps or changing the leaderboards, all these types of things. These are things that I can do in vMix that would be incredibly difficult to do inside of other production tools. But again, you need scripting, you need other things. So I think there are probably a few things that if vMix did, it would make a huge difference. And some of those would be things you can manipulate in GT Title Designer and things you can manipulate in layers. So really, if I just took those as like the two main ones that I see, that would open up a ton of possibilities for things that can be done. Other things become more, what I would like versus what somebody else would like. But I think collectively, I know for people that are trying to do multi-box shots with guests and would love to be able to say, gee, could I slide that guest a little more towards the center of the box that they have set up? No way to do that. You have to, when you put them in as layers, you then have to go in, open up the layer, and change that positioning of the element you have in the layer, as opposed to simply saying, gee, I could just do that dynamically and sort of push things around. So, there are lots of things that I know that would be beneficial in vMix. If they did that, hopefully, vMix is always pushing the envelope for things they want to add. And hopefully, as it continues to mature, those will be things that will go in there. But hopefully also, as more and more people get into scripting, which is part of what we're trying to encourage, there'll be more incentive to do these types of things because they'll see that, hey, there really is a community of users that can make use of this. So I think that's the other piece. So hopefully in some way, everybody picking up and doing these things will provide more motivation for some of the enhancements collectively that we'd love to see here. So America Newscape said, vMix put us in the game. Very grateful for its development. Absolutely. I mean, I think vMix really democratized video switching. There were other tools out there, but to be honest, they had lots of limitations. I think probably the two best tools out there for the average person would be vMix on the paid side and OBS on the free side. And vMix definitely has a lot of advantages, but you pay for those advantages. But if you needed to go sort of bare bones, dirt cheap, OBS is definitely a great tool. And we use OBS as a piece of other things we do. So with things like NDI, you can route something from vMix or from a camera into OBS and then into vMix again. So you could do things where you do processing. So for instance, there are things where there are sort of almost like filters that are built into OBS. So you could take a camera, put it through a blur filter, and feed that into vMix to create nice special effects where you have almost like a vignette with a mask where you see the blur and then you see the sharp image in the middle. Things like that, where you might not think of there isn't a direct way to do it inside of vMix. Well, using tools together, I think, can also make a big difference. So yeah, I mean, Studio Row said great. It's figuring out what you need to do and putting the right tools together to do the job, and that's really true. I think it isn't. It's what comes out the pipe at the end that people are going to look at and say, "Wow, that's impressive," or not. And so, I think creativity will play a large part. A lot of what we do here is really just trying to get people to think of different ways to use the tools that they have available. And it's not so much showing you the way to do a specific feature, because I don't know how many people are going to want to just highlight areas of a screen. It could be, a general use case, but there may be other things that people want to do with the way we described doing these types of masks. And that's the goal. Like, think of this now as just another tool you have that you can assemble to do other types of jobs that may come up. And we're really hopeful that as you find things, you share them with the community as well, because this is really the way we all learn. And I'm definitely grateful to a lot of people that have shared stuff with me through the years. And that's, I think, for all of us, that's an important part of how we grow as part of the community here. So, yeah, Vita said, OBS is an amazing piece of software. It's my go-to for screen capture. It's NDI. Yeah, and it is great for LED panels, and there are cool. OBS is really the perfect Swiss Army knife tool. It does a lot of little things. There are some big things it doesn't do that you'd love, where it doesn't have like built-in capabilities, but there are a lot of plugins for it. And that's the thing that makes it sort of the general utility. Take OBS, find a plugin, make sure it works and does what it says it does, and then use that either as a filter for something like an NDI stream when things are going through, or just switch a piece of your production in that you may need to switch there and bring it into something bigger in the context of how you'd like to package your entire production. So love OBS for that. Love OBS as a at the price point. Let's face it, having a solid tool with a lot of capabilities that comes in for free is always good. And that's why I think it's really, where you get the value you get from all these things. So that's why OBS has a fit, vMix has a fit, and for us and the things we do, TriCaster has a fit. So I think all of these just play for different roles in how productions take place. So, I mean, the other thing to keep in mind, and I think when you start as a smaller producer, you tend to be, I'm looking at things as a one-man band, and I just want to do everything on one screen or two screens in front of me. But as you get to bigger productions, even though, like with things like scripting and other things, you could do a ton of stuff. What you end up finding is that having people do different specialties, somebody worried all about graphics, somebody worried about onboarding remote guests, somebody worried about doing the actual switching. Having these specialties means that if something goes wrong in one of these areas, you have somebody who can focus on fixing it and getting that right, as opposed to, I'm trying to fix it while at the same time I'm trying to switch a show, while at the same time I'm trying to be host, while at the same time I'm trying to get a guest who's calling in to bring them on air. So that's the other thing. As you start to think of your tool set, you will, as your productions get bigger, move from looking at things as all-in-ones to really position-based specialties that you can combine. And there may be one person doing a switcher and doing the entire switch, but there may be other people that are doing all the things for feeding into that switch, and each of those will play an important role. So that's something else to consider. So even if you're doing this right now by yourself, you may look and say, gee, having things like NDI to combine different tools can really work, because now I can have one other person who can worry about things, and when the proverbial stuff hits the fan here, and which will happen in every production at some point, you have a way to deal with it, and you can execute sort of a plan B while things are going on to remedy whatever went wrong. So definitely things to consider when you think of tools. Think of also the people side of how you use those tools. So hopefully we've covered everything that people have. I think we've gone through pretty much everything we wanted to cover today. And this was a great discussion for sort of where we went into about scripting and coding and different tools that we have available. So thank you all. So we will be back next Friday for another show. So I want to say thank you very much. We really do appreciate everybody making the time to join. And we'll see you all next week. Take care, everyone.